Ready? Okay, Soledad, take it over.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the seminar, The Role of Trade in Food Security in Latin America and the Caribbean, organized by CSD R&D, the Environment, Rural Development, and Disaster Risk Management Division of the IDB. This event is part of the series, Seeds for Food Security, the bank is promoting to generate awareness and share knowledge about this urgent matter. Latin America and the Caribbean was the only region in the world to reduce hunger between 1990 and 2015. However, since then, food insecurity has become a structural problem in the region, which has been exacerbated by recent crises. Currently, 40% of the population in the region suffers from food insecurity. This means that more than 250 million people lack physical or economic access to safe and nutritious food to meet their daily needs for a healthy life, and 8.6% suffer hunger, according to the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. So today, we're here to discuss about the role and challenges of trade in achieving food security in the region. We'll start with a presentation by Valeria Piñeiro, Acting Head of the Latin American Region and Senior Research Coordinator. Then we'll follow with Stephen Block, Professor of the Food Policy Institute. Then we'll follow with Stephen Block, Professor of International Economics at the Tufts University. And then we'll have a very interesting panel discussion with both speakers and also by Pedro Martel, R&D Division Chief, and Jaime Granados, Trade and Investment Division Chief of the IDB. For those who are joining us on Zoom today, there is available interpretation to Spanish. To activate it, please click on the world icon located on the lower margin of the screen. So without further ado, I would like to invite Valeria.
Bueno, muy buenas tardes. Muy buenas tardes a todos. Para mí es un gusto realmente estar con ustedes acá, ver caras muy conocidas y caras nuevas. For us at IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute, we really like this theme about food security and trade. This is what we love to work on. So for us, it's a great opportunity to be able to be here and share also with you some of our work. So before I start, I will have to say that I need actually to thank my colleagues. I'm going to be showing a lot of figures in my presentation where they are based basically in 3 pieces of work that we've worked with. One was with David Laborde and Johan Swinen for the Routledge Handbook of Diets and Sustainable Diets, I think that it was called. And then the second one is a forthcoming report that we did with FAO, with my colleagues Agustín Tejeda and Nicolás Ilesca. And then the third one is a blog that we actually wrote about forgotten crops in Latin America that I did with Brian McNamara, that he's here with us today. So first of all, my thank you for my colleagues for using that information for this presentation. So I think that the first thing I would like to share with you is that we do have a challenge today. And the challenge that we have today is not only to produce more, but also a diverse range of nutritious foods in sufficient quantities, while also reducing greenhouse emissions and minimizing the impact on natural resources. Achieving these diverse goals requires an integrated strategy that takes into account increasing productivity, that is something that you in this division worked a lot on, but also environmental sustainability and food production systems that will focus in using efficiently all the natural resources, land, water, fertilizers, and energy. So this presentation will really just contribute or concentrate in the role of trade and how it contributes to really dealing with this challenge. So the first thing we need to mention is this question: how are we going to really feed the world in 2050, but in a sustainable way, given the current challenges that we have, which can include from geopolitics to everything else, including climate change, obviously. And we also have multiple goals. So we have some there that it is improved productivity, climate mitigation, improved nutrition, improved water, and so forth. Okay. So the first thing we have here. So the first thing I would like to show you is this thing of we have imbalances of food supply and demand around the world. So this figure, what it shows is the one on the left is that beyond calories, it shows the net imports and food consumption, but of proteins, highlighting the fact that for some countries, trade becomes crucial not only for the quantity of food needed for domestic consumption, but also for accessing and availability of proteins and nutrients that are needed in their diet. So the countries in the very dark green represent surplus in proteins, of course, meaning that they produce more than they import, while the other ones, the lighter colors, is the other way around. And instead of that, the figure on the right, it shows the number of food groups. We have 9 groups here that are animal products, milk, starches, legumes and beans, nuts and seeds, fruits, sugar, vegetable oils, with insufficient local production to achieve a healthy diet per country adjusted for food loss and waste. The darker color, what it shows is countries that have a higher number of food groups with insufficient local production to achieve these healthy diets that we were mentioning. So for example, if we picked Argentina, that it is the very light color, what it shows is that it has that level of sufficiency, while Madagascar, that it is in really dark color, it does not. So overall, in an average year, one average country in the world experiences deficiencies in 5.1 food groups, and 3/4 of countries have deficiencies in at least 4 groups or more. So here what I want to highlight is the role of trade, allowing agricultural trade, allowing the world to take advantage of these countries' heterogeneity, heterogeneity in terms of the endowments of natural resources, but also technology and other resources that they have that translates in different supply potential and food prices, of course, and environmental footprints as well. The other thing I want to highlight is that the policy environment around the food system has also a large influence on the nexus between trade, climate change, production, but also nutrition, through 4 drivers, we will like to call them. So it's how much we produce, what we produce, how we produce, and where we produce. And this table, the figures on the right, the only thing is that they looked at how also we're changing over time. So it compares 2008 with 2020 in terms of trade in dollars, also in calories, but also in the emissions. And we can see how countries or regions are really changing a little bit, having the high-income countries moving totally different than the low-income countries. Uy, murió. Ahí está, volvió. And then the last one that I wanted to show you is how Latin America and the Caribbean actually has been really contributing to global trade and food security. And what it shows here is the blue bars are the Latin American countries and Caribbean, showing how important they are. And if we see Brazil is number 1, Argentina is number 3, etc. And these are net food exporters, 2017 and 2021, the average and in values as well. Okay, so now we kind of have this big picture of what globally we're talking about. And now we would like to just concentrate in Latin America. And what I mean Latin America is, I'm going to show some figures, and I realized also that we'll cover some of that and that you also looked at some this morning. So I won't concentrate much on this. But the important thing here is that we do need to, when we look at Latin America has 2 different roles when we look in food security. We really need to take in consideration and take care of food security inside the region, but we also need to look at how the region can contribute to global food security. So it kind of has two different points of view, but it's the same thing. We're still talking about food security. We're still talking about how we can increase production and how we can use trade as a way to balancing those differences that we have. So the first thing we need to look at, and I'm going to show you, is how heterogeneous the region is, and I mean Latin America. We need to look at the prevalence of undernourishment, the cost of diets, and the relationship with food security, the composition of the food basket in Latin America, and then self-sufficiency that is also in this region, trade, and last, we're going to look at competitiveness of the region. So the first one I want to see is Latin America and the Caribbean is very heterogeneous in terms of the commodities that we produce and that we export, but also in terms of, are we net food exporters at a global or also inside the region? So that's what it means, that table that I have there, in which we looked at if you are a regional exporter, global exporter, or global importer, and how that combination of different groups. So when looking at, okay, what are we going to do in the region in terms to promote exports, for example, and that is something also that JB cares about, we need to kind of consider also this. Depending on where you're situated in that box, are the opportunities and the challenges you're going to be facing moving forward. And then this one is the prevalence of undernourishment in Latin America, measured in millions of people, but also in percentage of population. And we can see how we were doing really better till 2014, and then we're just increasing after that. And of course, the line is the millions, and the other one is the percentage. And here I just want to highlight a couple of things. The first one is that we have now 56 million people in the region were affected by hunger between 19 and 21, the last years, and that this number also grew by 13 million since the outbreak of COVID-19 in 2019. And also at the sub-regional level, South America saw the largest increase in undernourishment between the same period, 2019 and 21, having an additionally 11 million people. Even though South America is still the lowest in the region, it has the biggest increase, and that is something to take into consideration. And then if we looked at sub-regions, we can see that Haiti is still having the highest rate in the Caribbean with 47%, Nicaragua having the biggest in Mesoamerica, and Venezuela, of course, in South America, but followed by Ecuador, Bolivia, and also Brazil in that region. And we can look at more details in the numbers, but I think that you saw it also earlier today. And then the other one is that I want to highlight is the how we can look, or how we should be looking at these two indicators together. So we have the cost and affordability of a healthy diet, but we also need to look at it into terms of the food insecurity. And the one on the figure on the right, what it shows is the in percentage is the difference between 2014 and 16, with 2019 and 21 being the lines, the last one, so that we can always see that we're worse off compared to the previous years or period of years evaluated there. And then the other one is the composition of the food basket measured in calories intake is the 16 and 19 divided by the three regions that we were looking at. And what it is clear is that cereals has the highest percentage of that in all countries, except I think that it was Dominican Republic, which it was less. But then in terms of the second group of commodities, Caribbean has fruits and vegetables as the second one. The Mesoamerican country has sugar and cocoa, and then South America is meat and fish. So that there are still differences also in the basket of commodities that it is consumed inside Latin America. And then this one, what it shows is the self-sufficiency. So it's the autoabastecimiento, as we call it in Spanish. And we show here only 4 different groups of commodities. And I put them all together in one figure because it kind of tells you a little bit of how countries differ as well in terms of regions. We can see that cereal, meat, and fish behave kind of on the same way, and having South America being the highest one in terms of self-sufficiency. But then fruits and vegetables, Mexico and Central America have something to say here. And then dairy and eggs, which I think that the being local more and because they are perishables and everything in each region, they have a bigger role to play in terms of consumer. Okay. And then the other thing is looking at exports and imports. And we can see here, obviously, how Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico are the biggest exporters. And as a matter of fact, Argentina and Brazil are also net food exporters. But then in terms of imports, we still have Mexico and Brazil big. Obviously, we have to consider as well the size of the countries here, no? So we need to look at this also in per capita if we really want to take into consideration that kind of things. But this is some other indicator that it really shows us or give us a picture of how the region is and what it is important for each of these sub-regions inside Latin America. And then the last one that I would like to leave you with is this reveal competitiveness. No, so this is just a Valras kind of analysis, but again, how it is overlapping with the previous figures that I was showing, in which South America they are competitive. But something to notice here is that even though we have 17 countries with agri-food trade deficit, only 8 countries of those show a revealed competitiveness lower than 0, which means that they are not very competitive, which it would be some of these Caribbean countries, showing really that in general, countries in the region exhibit relative competitiveness in the production and exports of agri-food products. Obviously, the highest ones in terms of this competitiveness is Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, Ecuador, Uruguay, but it also shows Nicaragua and Costa Rica. So that is something to notice. So I'm going to be discussing, just leave you with 3 focus points, which is the relationship between trade and nutrition, trade and climate change, and the role of innovation in dealing or helping these ones as well. So the first one will be this trade and nutrition is the same figure that I already explained to you, but I think that it really highlights very well that countries with efficient food production in some food groups to deliver healthy diets. What's the differences? Not only looking at Latin America and the Caribbean, but if then you look at the other regions in the world. So you can see how the colors in Latin America, they are lighter colors compared to Africa that are very dark. That shows you that they are very insufficient compared with Latin America. And so trade could definitely be a source of dealing with this food diversity. As I think that we'll mention later, having a diverse diet, it always contributes to having this healthy as well. And then there will be some new consumption opportunities. Some of them will be healthy. Some of them may be the unhealthy ones, the very processed foods. So that we will need to take that into consideration or keep an eye on that. And there are 2 things that I just want to mention to you, but the importance or the role that labeling food will have, and then also food safety. And the other one is, if we looked at trade and climate change, one of the key things that is going to happen is that we will be faced with some adaptation challenges, but more than anything, they may happen some shifts in comparative advantages between countries once that we are faced with climate change. So these figures, what they showed is the one on the one. First of all, they are based on some crop modelings. We looked at 30 of them, and the way we combine them, and then it shows is the comparison between the year 20-year average from 2091 to 2010, and then we compare that with the results that we get from 2041 and 2060. Again, the 2 average, and what it shows is the difference. And the figure on the left, what it shows is the annual precipitation, displaying the average change across these 30 models that I mentioned. And what we see is that we will see a significant reduction in precipitation is observed in, for example, Venezuela. So it's the darker orange colors, the Guyanas, Northern Brazil, and Central America. And instead of that, will be large increases in the Andes Mountains range, again, as well as in Argentina and Uruguay. So we can see that there are differences. And then the figure on the right, what it shows is changes in temperature. And again, we'll see that there will be differences inside the region. and how those two things will or may have an impact then in the comparative advantages. So for example, maize will be different. There will be maybe a switch of producing maize in the northern of Brazil compared to the rest, but some other countries may be influenced by that. And then I just want to leave you with this innovation. So innovation can play a role in many different ways. First of all, we need to keep worrying about innovation in terms of keeping our productivity so that we can keep producing in a sustainable way and all that. But I want to show you one case of that we can mention about innovation, which it was quinoa and how it relates to trade. So quinoa became very popular, as we all know. It was a big discussion about what happened in Peru. There were more demand of exports of quinoa. There was a transition period in which, in between the starting of that and the local consumption of quinoa, everything went to exports because the prices were higher. So there was a transition period there. But what it showed was that at the end, there was a transformation in the quinoa production, in the way it was produced and the amounts that they were produced. So that at the very end, income from those farmers were higher. And so it really helped the development of those countries. They changed also and they adopted a new technology package as well, so that the yields actually went up at the same time that the prices went up. Now that the market has stabilized a little bit, we still see that the producers still are more competitive. They have higher yields per hectare than previously. So it shows a very good example of a nice thing. And then the figure on the right, what it shows is how that we can see in the increases in production, and now how Bolivia and Peru, for example, are biggest exporters of that commodity. And then here to leave is, well, we are faced with climate change. What are we going to be needing and how is it achieved? So international trade definitely allows a better use of the scarce resources that we have, natural resources. International trade also is part of the adaptation strategy that we have to think about, and it also may contribute to the mitigation efforts. So climate change will bring us a shift in comparative advantages. It will also create new environmental sustainability response, and by this is interventions and policies. It could be a good intervention, like a good incentive for actually conditional policy, for example, that will incentivize the producers to have a new technology that it is good for the environment, for example. But it could be something also with respect to the CBAM or some other responses from countries. And then the dietary transition that we also mentioned here. What are we going to be needing? We will need the increase in productivity. We will also need to improve logistics and infrastructures to be able to move around all this production in a manner that it is efficient and also sustainable. And then, of course, that we can also look at some commercial integration, how we can be more efficient, how we can do it better. And then how we're going to achieve this, it will be in R&D, in investment, and also all these regulatory convergence, labeling, and so forth that we also mentioned. And then just to finish, I would like just to highlight a initiative that we are doing IFPRI with IICA and the University of Notre Dame, in which the IDB is also part of this, and Lina and Polo are part of this team. And what we're working is in how we can really create the evidence that it is needed for countries to use the right interventions to achieve, to have a sustainable food system. And it will be, of course, that around innovation. And we're picking 3 different pillars. One, it will be innovation in policy, another one, innovation in technology, and the last one is the innovation in institutions, in which we pick something related with climate action. And just let me finish with this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valeria. Stephen, the floor is yours.
this one, right? For some reason, it's not letting me know.
I think you want to minimize the window so that you can get to the point right here. Oh, you could do slideshow.
So
There we go.
there we go.
Okay, we're all set. I'm not going to use this. Thank you very much. This is my first visit to the IDB, and I'm very happy to be here. And I want to thank Pedro and Lena for inviting me. I will be presenting the highlights of a few papers that were produced by this Food Prices for Nutrition project at Tufts University, which is led by my colleague, Will Masters. I've been a collaborator on this project for several of the papers. And the works that I'm going to describe are going to be narrower in focus and broader in sort of country coverage than what Valeria was talking about. But I'll highlight some of the Latin American aggregates where I can. And what I'm going to try to address are 5 fairly broad questions here.
For some reason, it's not sharing.
Okay, can I keep going? Okay. So I want to address these questions. How can we use dietary guidelines to measure the cost and affordability of healthy diet? So there'll be some direct overlap with what Valeria was talking about. We'll take a quick look at what's included in the retail price of food. What if we decompose it into the stages in the food chain, in the value chain? What is the cost of a healthy diet in different parts of the world? And I'll highlight some results for Latin America and the Caribbean at that level of aggregation. And then on the question of
Can you get a little closer to the mic? It's hard to hear.
yeah, on the question of trade, I'm going to show some results that have to do with the question of tariff reform. So not on the role of trade, which we know for all the reasons that Valeria talked about are very important, but I'm going to focus on a specific question having to do with tariff reform for food products. And then ask the broader question of how affordable are healthy diets in Latin America and around the world. And the context here is in the context of food security and the way we understand food security, which traditionally had just been, do you have enough calories? Sure. Okay. What the broad goal of this Food Prices for Nutrition project is to present new ways of measuring sort of the cost and affordability as a metric for food security. Are we okay now? So after the initial, notion that it was just calories, by the 1990s, the definition of food security, there are about 70 different definitions of food security if you look at the literature. But broadly speaking, once we got to the 1990s, it was broadened from just access to calories to access to desired foods at all times for all people, and definitions that I know that you have heard. And so the innovation that we're proposing through this Food Prices for Nutrition project is to be able to use data on retail prices for hundreds and hundreds of foods. So we get these from the International Comparisons Project data, and to track the cost and affordability of these diets, and also to try to get a sense of affordability and access, so that once we understand the cost of a healthy diet, we can ask questions about, well, to the extent that people can't afford healthy diets, is it because the prices are too high? Is it because they're too poor? And what are the food choices that people are making? Because we know that that's also a function of income and education and so on. So just starting with the broad question of what is it that we're looking at when we see the retail price of food? So this is US data over this period, 1993 to 2021. And you would tend to think, when you look at the retail price, less than 10% of it is farm production. And in the US, the largest share, there's a blue, I don't know if I have a pointer here, but the blue share in the middle is processing and packaging. And you can see that as we compare that with, that's food consumed at home. On the right-hand side, it's food and beverages consumed away from home. And there, 3/4 of the cost when you see the retail price is actually retail trade and food services. So in that case, because the prices are themselves higher, the share going to the farmers is actually less than 2% on average. So I think it's just an interesting context to start thinking about what we see when we see food prices. And the volatility of these food prices also differs substantially at different levels in the marketing chain. So, for example, the restaurant prices in brown on the top trace inflation. It's indexed to 1990. So at 100, it kind of traces it. It rises a little bit more since say 2015. And then the blue are the grocery prices, which basically track inflation, which is not surprising because they're a core part of the inflation calculation anyway. But I think the main takeaway from this particular slide is that the volatility is really at the wholesale level for the unprocessed foods, where you can see it fluctuates much more widely than the retail and restaurant prices. Okay, so that's sort of background. Now, what we're really hoping that we can contribute through the research that I'm going to describe is how we can measure the cost of healthy diets. And in asking that question, we have to first ask, well, what are the relevant standards? What do we mean when we're talking about a healthy diet? And there are actually different ways to do that. And so at the very basic level, we could think about a diet that just, what's the least cost? So in each of these aggregates that I'm going to talk about, it's always going to be the least cost approach to achieving a certain standard. And the least cost approach to achieving sufficient caloric intake, we'll call COCA, cost of caloric intake. So that would be just the lowest level. And on the global average, using 2017 prices from the International Comparisons Project, that winds up being 83 cents a day. So that's just basic caloric adequacy. And the next higher level would be the least cost diet that achieves nutritional adequacy. This would be based on dietary recommendations, which have both minimum and maximum intakes for macro and micronutrients. And so the least cost for the daily energy and the nutritional adequacy are things that we have solved for doing linear programming models for each country, again, using this very large data set of prices from the International Comparisons Project. But we've been talking initially about healthy diets, and that's a higher standard. And I'll show you how in our studies we do that. But you can see that the costs go up quite substantially, right? The caloric, a diet that's sort of adequate in calories alone, 83 cents a day. Nutritional adequacy on average globally, $2.46 a day. And the healthy diet in the basket that I'll describe is yet more expensive at $3.31 a day. And then there's the question of what do people actually spend? Because on average, people are spending $5.46 a day, well above the requirements for these least cost diets, no matter how you define it. And that gets into some questions that Valeria referenced as well, as to, in terms of what are people eating? Are they always healthy choices? Are they, ultra processed foods and so on? Okay, so in each case, we're going to calculate these things using the least expensive locally available foods from the market prices within each country. So this table shows for the nutritional adequacy and the caloric adequacy, what are the least cost diets in different parts of the world. And what we see, I think that's fairly striking, and I think we've heard this before, but worldwide, if we just look at 174 countries, right, you can see that the minimum cost, the least cost diet that meets nutritional requirements costs $1.35 a day in international dollars, 2017 international dollars. Latin America and the Caribbean is significantly more expensive. It's actually the second most expensive region in these regional aggregates at $1.68 a day, second only to North America, which is $1.89. So that's a question. I don't know why that's the case, but that's a question I think that would be interesting to discuss. Why is a nutritionally adequate diet really quite expensive relative to other regions when we look at Latin America and the Caribbean? Now, shifting to the second column of the minimum cost for a diet that's just providing adequate calories, we can see that the global average is 57 cents a day. In Latin America, 81 cents a day, which is tied for first place with the Middle East and North Africa. Now, we asked two further questions of these data. One is, what would be the premium? What's the ratio between a least cost diet that achieves nutritional adequacy relative to simply caloric adequacy? And here we see that worldwide, that ratio is just a little under 2.7, 2.66. So you spend, more than 2.5 times to achieve adequate nutrition relative to simply having enough calories. In Latin America and the Caribbean, that ratio is 2.2. So it's a little less than the world average, which is maybe a good thing, except the reason it's less is because the calories cost more in Latin America. So that affects the ratio. And then finally, we look at the affordability of these diets. So that would be not just the cost, but the cost relative to, say, average household expenditures. What is the share of an average household expenditure that's required to achieve this minimum nutritionally adequate diet? Globally, it's 14% of average household expenditures. In Latin America, it's actually lower. It's only 9% of the average household expenditure, because the incomes in Latin America are higher than some of the other regions around the developing world. But even so, if we think about it, this relative to poverty, this $1.68 a day to achieve nutritional adequacy, if you were living at the global sort of threshold for severe poverty of $2.15 and facing food prices in Latin America and the Caribbean, you would have to spend about 80% of your total budget just to achieve a diet every day that has adequate nutrition. So that is, I think, a point worth noting. And then we can look at those data. This is the ratio. This is the premium for the cost of nutritional adequacy over caloric adequacy. And if you just want to focus on the Latin American segment, you can see that Mexico, for example, is quite high. Venezuela is quite high. Colombia, relatively high. But we show this in the global context. So Mexico higher than the United States in terms of that ratio. Now, I want to talk a little bit about what we mean by a healthy diet basket. Now, you had how many? You had like 8 food groups, 9 food groups. So we are working with 6 food groups. And the question is, what's the least cost combination of foods in every country? So we've done this for 177 countries. And the question is, what is the least cost selection of commodities to meet the standards that we're using for the healthy diet basket? So ignoring Senegal for a moment, just to point to the way we're doing this, we're working with 6 food groups. And this is based on dietary guidelines from a large number of countries. So, for example, animal source foods, the healthy diet basket that we're proposing, you have to have 2 items from animal source foods, and you can see the caloric requirements for each one. In this instance, 150 kilocalories for each of those 2 items. 1 item from edible oil, 300 calories. Pulses, 1 item to be selected, 300 calories. And you can see then for vegetables, it's 3 vegetables, 2 fruits, 2 starchy staples. This adds up to a daily intake of about 2,300 kilocalories. So it's a healthy diet basket. And what we do is we look at the prices in each country for about 700 foods and calculate the price per calorie for each food, and then we have an algorithm that selects the 2 or 1 or 3 foods from each group that satisfy those requirements at the least cost, right? So, for example, for Senegal, that healthy diet basket costs $2.29 a day. And the relative areas of the colors around the edge of the donut there show the expenditure shares required for each of those food groups. And so, I have several examples here. The next page is Latin American examples. But you can see that healthy diet basket in Pakistan selects different commodities for each food group and costs significantly more, $3.44 a day. For Italy, it winds up being cheaper than Pakistan. And you can see again that the commodities that are selected based on local market prices change from country to country. So, you know, the starchy staple in Italy is pasta, not a big surprise. The colors are different on this, but yesterday we added these examples from Latin America. So I have Mexico and Brazil. And you can see that, I don't know if the writing is clear enough, but to see the specific commodities that are there, there's a fair amount of commonality across the specific foods that are in the healthy diet for these two countries, but the prices are quite different. So $3.08 a day for that least cost healthy diet in Mexico, as compared with $2.81 for that least cost diet in Brazil. And as I said, we do this for almost 700 foods. So they wind up being quite specific in their recommendations. You probably can't see the text, but for example, the animal source foods in Mexico are milk and chicken, but specifically chicken legs. And in Brazil, it's milk and chicken, but specifically whole frozen chicken, because there are so many line items in the whole list of foods that we're working with. So it becomes quite specific, but you get the point. Now, I want to turn to the question of trade a little bit. This is now a different paper where we were asked by the FAO to address the question of tariff reform for foods and what would the impact of tariff reform be on this least cost healthy diet in around the world. But I have some results for Latin America. And you can see, first of all, that so in the first column, it's the percentage of retail foods with an imported primary commodity. So we had to match primary commodity imports to retail to final foods. So for example, is there a tariff on wheat imports? How does that affect the price of bread in a given country? And you can see that most foods, on average, a little over half, have an imported primary ingredient. And then the second column is really, I think, maybe the most critical one here, which is asking of the retail price of the final food, what percentage of that is the import cost of the primary ingredient? Because that's going to be part of the calculation of what's the impact of tariffs and tariff reform, right? And you can see that it varies from 10 to 26%. On average, it's 17. So not a huge share of the final cost component. A little over a third of imported products face any tariff at all. And this is globally, so 144 countries. So then we asked the question, well, what would happen if you eliminated all the import tariffs on these primary commodities? And so what would be the sort of power of that for reducing the cost of healthy diets? And it turns out not very much. This is not to diminish in any way the role of trade, but it's just to say that with regard to this very specific question of what if you were to eliminate the tariffs on primary imports, primary ingredient imports, how much would it lower the cost of a healthy diet? And in Latin America, you can see so the red is the effect of eliminating all tariffs. The blue is the effect of eliminating all non-tariff measures. So that would be quotas, phytosanitary standards, and so on. You can see that the Latin America and Caribbean actually has the highest impact from tariff reform, and it's sort of in the middle of the pack in terms of the potential impact of eliminating non-tariff barriers to these primary ingredient imports. But the numbers are small, right? It's a 1.13% impact from tariffs and an additional 2.12 from non-tariff measures. So together, 3.25% of the cost of a least cost healthy diet. That would be the reduction from eliminating tariffs. As I say, this was work that we did for the FAO, and these results are here in the map. So this is the tariff reduction and the effect of eliminating tariffs on diet costs, and you can see not a lot of action here. A little bit more action on the non-tariff measures. The numbers are still relatively small, and in Latin America and the Caribbean, again, it's Colombia that sort of stands out relative to the other countries in the region, but still the numbers are relatively small. So just a few broader points in conclusion to summarize some of the takeaways from these different standards for dietary adequacy. The one thing you can see here is that when we look at the open circles here, those are the cost of caloric adequacy, the least cost calorically adequate diet. And you can see that it's actually a little bit cheaper in the wealthier countries, if we look at the trend, than it is in poor countries. And the costs really are fairly flat. The gradient is pretty flat when we look at the cost for nutritional adequacy or for the healthy diet, the least cost healthy diet, from the poor to the richer countries. But what we also see when we do this analysis is that there are about 3 billion people in the world that cannot afford a healthy diet. And you can see that the green squares are the healthy diet, the least cost healthy diet. I put in the $2.15 poverty line in this graph just to illustrate how that would look relative to severe poverty. And the answer is people living in severe poverty simply can't afford healthy diets and are very unlikely to be able to afford nutritionally adequate diets. Now, what people actually spend, there is a very steep gradient. And you can see that at the left-hand side of this graph, the actual expenditures on food are less than the cost of a healthy diet in a number of the poorest countries. And then at the high end of the income spectrum here, we see food expenditures well in excess of the least cost healthy diets. And that does raise questions about sort of the nutritional benefits on the margin of those kinds of expenditures. I think just 2 more slides. So this is looking again at countries at different levels of income and asking what proportion of them are food insecure and what proportion of them can afford healthy diets, right? So the green dots are the proportion of the population that cannot afford a healthy diet. And you can see quite high proportions of the population for countries with incomes below 25,000 per capita, let's say, and that's in PPP terms. And it's highly correlated with the prevalence of food insecurity, where here we're defining food insecurity as person's access to the foods they usually eat. So in the end, I think the takeaways are that there are about 3 billion people out of 8 billion in the world who cannot afford healthy diets, that nutrient-rich diets are expensive, and it's more expensive to provide a nutrient-rich diet than a diet that's primarily starchy staples. So how do we fix this? Well, at times in places where prices are high, maybe supply improvements, and you were talking about productivity, so that would obviously be a critical component for addressing the unaffordability of healthy diets. And then on the other side of that would be income and generating. Of course, the productivity would also raise income. Often we find for the 5 billion people that can afford healthy diets, that's not the diet that they choose, which kind of opens the door to a different discussion. But many factors beyond health per se are driving food choices: convenience, advertising, and all kinds of stuff like that, ultra-processed foods that are highly palatable, and so on. And so wealthier people tend to overshoot in a number of these food categories. And often eat food that's prepared away from the home, which also may be less nutritious. And so the final point is that I think the value of doing this analysis of least cost healthy diets kind of has some potential policy guidance in it, because it will highlight, for example, which items have the most potential to improve the affordability of healthy diets, and where people can't afford them, it would suggest where income or safety nets would be critical components of policy portfolios, and which other foods enter to displace the least cost healthy diets. That might be a reflection of lack of knowledge or preferences or market failures. And the bottom line is it's challenging to have a healthy diet. So that's my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Let's now start the panel discussion. Pedro?
Okay, so I'm the host, I think. So I'm not going to be the first one. So I'm going to let Jaime be the first to have a little chat here. And then I have a couple of, if he doesn't touch it on those, I'll come back to a couple of things that I'm very interested in. Thanks very much, guys. Very good presentations.
Thank you very much, Pedro and R&D for this invitation. It's not the first time that we work together. In fact, we've been doing it now for years. Very nice to see a lot of familiar faces, people with whom I have even gone on supervision missions and visits and technical discussions on the ground. So very happy to be here today and very interested in the discussions that we just heard. There are comments, there are questions, there are things that I would like to say. This is a very complex issue. I first would like to tell you more or less what we are doing at the trade and investment, or in general, at the trade and integration sector on these dimensions of trade and agriculture. Because definitely it called our attention, and not only because there's a new challenge in Latin America regarding safe security, but because we are foreseeing and we have been observing that in general, Latin America has a great, absolutely fantastic potential in terms of tackling, the needs of the worldwide needs of food in the short term, in the medium term, in the longer term. But also we have the potential to contribute to mitigate food insecurity. So we are not addressing this from the rather narrow angle of food insecurity, and even not from the nutritious dimension, which are important, but we believe that we, from the trade and investment sector, we can and should address this issue from a broader perspective, because there are a lot of products that we produce from the region that may not fall within, some of these broader categories in which there's a potential, a very important potential, and we can not only supply food to vulnerable countries around the world and in the region, but also to major OECD markets, which are huge consumers of our goods and also of our food-related services as well, because that's another dimension that we need to study. So we are focusing on addressing these issues and to have some knowledge. So rather than sharing knowledge here with you, what I'm going to do is to share what we are doing to generate knowledge that we're going to provide in a few months with the help of, for instance, IFPRI, FAO, and other important stakeholders in this community, in this discussion, for these discussions, because we are heading now towards the regional policy dialogue, in which we're going to introduce some of these topics, but we believe that in less than a year, probably by mid-2024, we will have a set of analysis and knowledge products addressing these very important issues. Again, because we believe that trade addresses all of these dimensions in terms of accessibility, in terms of use, in terms of disposition, in terms of stability. All those different dimensions of food insecurity can be addressed somehow by trade. And by trade, I mean trade in the broader possible meaning of the word. I mean not only actual transactions of goods and services, but also I mean negotiations, trade, agricultural trade negotiations, and I also mean investment, productive investment. I mean harmonization at the regional level. So we've seen that many of these issues are relevant for all of these discussions. So what we have been doing in fact, we're working with IFPRI right now, is to try to identify where are the opportunities for the bank in order to have a broader discussion, a broader dialogue with the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean, in order to promote an operational agenda and a knowledge agenda that can help them overcome or to take advantage of the opportunities, as well as to overcome the many challenges that we are facing. Because in order to tackle some of these opportunities, we will have to also address many of the challenges of many nature. Challenges in terms of what we call from the farm inside productivity issues that you are very familiar, to trade, logistics, et cetera, including sustainability requirements such as those related to, for instance, the European Union guidelines on deforestation free, et cetera, and the fork to table, farm to table policies, et cetera, which are very challenging, and they have a lot of questions as to how they are going to impact our production here in Latin America. How are we going to help the SMEs? What kind of policies and what kind of programs are we going to offer to our clients in order to overcome those challenges, et cetera, et cetera. So we keep on working with you on that front. So in order to address all of these issues, what we are doing is to start things, first of all, with a series of analysis geared towards the identification of the global demand. What is the global demand? How is it going to behave over the course of the next 10, 15, 20, 25 years? What are the different scenarios? How those scenarios are going to change? What kind of disruptors and to what extent those disruptors should be taken into account in those different scenarios? And by disruptors, we all mean the same: climate change, demographic shifts and preferences, a shock on productivity, a shock on trade policy, a shock on geopolitics, etc. So we are trying to discuss all those different dimensions with IFPRI and colleagues and come out with standardized demand scenarios that we can work later on, immediately later on, at the sub-regional level. So first we are establishing those scenarios, and then we're going to move on and to address and apply those scenarios, those standard scenarios at the sub-regional level. How is Central American countries going to react to those scenarios? How is the Southern countries going to react? The Andean community, the Caribbean community countries, what are the opportunities? What are the main challenges that they have? What are the bottlenecks in terms of trade and investment that they would have? Because that's the agenda that we want to address with the client countries, etc. So that is going to be the logic of this kind of analysis that we are pursuing. And simultaneously, we're also undertaking what we call the horizontal or transversal studies and analysis. That is, issues related to, for instance, food safety, inocuidad de los alimentos. Also issues related to sustainability because of the many requirements that there are right now in terms of demands that are going to be imposed on our exporters, particularly SMEs, etc. So we are working at that stage, and we are factoring all of these different dimensions into one single narrative that we want to present to the countries later next year in order to identify what are the main bottlenecks in terms of trade and investment, how we are going to address those issues, and what the bank has to provide in order to increase the potential of countries of Latin America and the Caribbean in supplying foods or mitigating food vulnerabilities that they may have. So it's quite a challenge that we have. We believe that we are in the capable hands of a very, very good team, and we have some of them here with Paulo, etc. We work with your Paolo also, and with Lina, etc. We are, working together in order to be able to capture what are the really important problems and being able to come out with what we believe are the most relevant solutions for the Latin American countries that we have. So this is essentially what we are right now doing. We've been discussing these issues with our colleagues from R&D, with Pedro, with Lina, with Paolo, etc. And we will continue doing this. So this is basically to keep everybody aligned with what we've been doing. And that's what I guess one of the most important things that I wanted to discuss here. Now, if I may have some questions and comments and points that I would like to raise on some of the issues. With Valeria, we speak on an almost weekly basis, right? Because we are engaged in this together, and we have IFPRI contracted as one of our consultants. Stephen, however, I just met you today, but quite a pleasure to be here with you. You pointed out something about the kind of the limitations that in your model would have, or the limited relevance that the trade policy may have. And you define trade policy as tariff, essentially, a very narrow, specific approach. So my question would be, what would be a broader approach? Because, again, the fact that your studies reflect a relatively modest role of trade here in promoting, the more healthy and nutritious consumption diet in Latin America and the Caribbean would not be that important. However, the fact that it doesn't look very important right now may be a reflection of trade negotiations carried out in the past. The fact that we were able to agree at the multilateral level in the agricultural negotiations of the Uruguay round, a much lower level of tariff protection. We were able to harness, although only partially, the role of other deterrents, other trade, non-tariff barriers, such as subsidies, such as domestic support, such as other fiscal incentives. And probably the tariff component is not, capturing the importance of other logistic costs that may be in ports and airports and border crossings, etc. So there may be some other roles over there of trade that we are ready to tackle as part of our agenda that may not be reflected in this kind of studies. What would you say about that?
You're right.
Take
Nice.
note, take note, everybody.
Yeah. No, I mean, the work that we were doing was asking a very specific question using data from a very particular period of time when it became possible to even ask those questions at that ground. The FAO was surprised as well, actually, by the small numbers that we came up with. But I think to say, well, what would a broader approach be? Because we were asking the very narrow question, right, about primary ingredients as a component of a retail price. You could have the whole commodity, the whole final product being imported, right? And that's not what we were looking at. And that's probably most of trade, right? And so actually, I think the answer when you ask, well, what would a broader picture look like? I would actually want to see your slides where you had, the deficit and surplus for various food groups and the magnitudes of those deficits and surpluses, because that's really where the power of trade will come in. And I think also just tying in some of the other issues here, I think that the question of trends in climate change and how that will affect you were looking at one point in time the surplus and deficit, and then the projections going forward are I think amplifying the importance of trade, but also maybe making trade more difficult politically, right? We haven't talked about winners and losers from trade, and I think that would have to be part of the story too.
I think that also the key issue there is actually what Stephen just said. The what it was captured there, it was just the component of imports as intermediate part. And what we've been saying about food security and trade is that what really helps, one of the biggest contributions is that it allows you to have a more diverse diet and to play with the seasonality. So those are two key things from trade that they were not captured there. And what it showed that figure was, for example, looking at Latin America, that we all understand when we looked at the tariffs, clearly Latin America is not as well integrated in terms of tariffs. Some countries don't have all the agreements. Yes, the Peru and the Pacifics, but for example, Mercosur hasn't really agreed. So that is why you see that Latin America was the biggest, but we're pretty much globalized, as we mentioned, in terms of just that tariff. So it was very small. And then the other thing is that they were looking at just the cost. So it was just a matter of that. So you started it from a little thing, even though you change a lot, it's not going to get you that far at the end.
So I'm gonna take the mic now. Thanks again very much for both of your presentations. They were very interesting. Different perspectives, same topic. One thing, Valeria, and let me put you on the spot. Might be a difficult question, might be an easy question. Trade is increasing. Agricultural trade is increasing, it's not decreasing. The region is an important part in that trade overall. And there's, I believe, if I'm not mistaken by numbers, there's also increase in intra-regional trade. So the numbers are going up. Trade is increasing. There's more out there supply. There's more exchange. But food security is not improving in our region. Not everything is due to trade in terms of food security. But what's your thought there? Why haven't we seen better numbers in food insecurity, while at the same time we're seeing increase in trade? And we always think about trade as one of the tools to improve food insecurity. And it's counterintuitive what's happening and the numbers, what they are telling us, right? So that's one big question for you, because I if not, I'll forget what I wanted to ask Steve. And on Steve's side, I think I like at the end when you bring in the social protection programs to the discussion and you say, hey, a lot of this is ability to access those foods for the lowest incomes people. That's a very interesting thing. We've had other discussions with our colleagues from social protection. One of the things, though, it's like, to me, it's I don't want to sound arrogant. It's not that surprising that the cost of the CPI or the retail price of food attributed to primary production is very low. But that doesn't mean that it's not important to have low cost or increased production and productivity at the primary level in terms of what the signals are going to be down for the upper parts of that composition. I wanted your thoughts on that because this morning we discussed what's going on in the futures markets and several of these products, especially starchy foods and things like that. But we were saying that's not the most important part of the final price consumers are gonna see. But whatever is happening in that variability that you show, it actually has an important impact in the final composite product. So just your thoughts on, yes, it's small, but still important, that little portion, that 10%, that 9, 10, 12%. And it actually translates, because of that variability, may have more impact on the final price that the consumers are going to be facing at a certain point. Just wanted your thoughts on that. So the two questions there, sorry. Different level of questions.
No, yeah, this one works. So I think that I cannot answer that question, Pedro, in 1 minute. But if you give me just 1 minute, I will just say that food security is more just than quantity. So yes, we may see that maybe there is more production of really just staple goods, which it will be just the calories also. But what it is key here is the affordability. So how that cost of a healthy diet, or not even healthy, just the cost of eating it is. And I think that that's what we've been seeing lately, not only with the inflation. First of all, in Latin America, we had now many countries that are really facing with high levels of inflation. And I'm not even talking just about Venezuela and Argentina, they're off the roof, some other ones as well. So what we've seen lately is really big changes in the cost or in the affordability of those diets, which I think that have been increased. On top of that, you have all the shocks related with income. So it's not only that the cost of the diets have increased, but it is also that incomes also have been hit for COVID, for this or that lately. So I think that the combination of the two things are the key thing, which is, again, not related with trade. With trade, what we actually accomplish, and it was seen with COVID, for example, is that in reality, the agri-food system behaved very well compared to other sectors. And it was just because we kept trading and we keep finding other ways of moving the goods around. And the key example is what happened now with the Russia invading Ukraine and the war and all that, is how things shifted. And so we kept moving things around. But again, one story also is when we talked about just staples, another different story is when we talked about perishables and other goods. So that's when the complexity starts kicking in, and that's when my minute ran out, but that could be a follow.
I want to answer the question you asked Valeria rather than the question you asked me, but I'll try mine as well. But I think if the question is, why has food insecurity increased despite the increase in trade? It's a compelling question. If I were going to try to research that question in a more rigorous way, I would want to know the counterfactual, right? What would the food security situation have been in the absence of trade? And I think we would share a hope that it's better off with trade, but I think that's the standard against which you would want to address that question. In terms of small differences having a big impact in the price, I think, yeah, I mean, the last slide I showed that had, an income, it showed income per capita across countries. And there was a very steep gradient with respect to food insecurity and ability to afford a healthy diet. So I think that underscores your point, which is that given how steep that slope was as income per capita was increasing, that small differences could make a big difference to people at the low end of the income distribution. So that point is very well taken.
Thanks. So I know that there are people on the floor that want to ask questions. I see some hands and legs like becoming a little bit nervous. I want to ask a question. I want to ask a question. So before I give the floor to other people, just want to give you a second or 30 seconds to talk about Avanzar 2030, if you may, Valeria, because I know that it's an interesting thing, and I think you
Pedro.
just didn't have the time to.
I can't wait
explain
to
it.
start. So, and I will talk 2 minutes about that. No, I'm just kidding. I'm actually very passionate about that this initiative, and Lina is already smiling. I convinced them to join me in this, Lina and Paolo. This is initiative that, again, we're doing IFPRI with the University of Notre Dame and with IICA. And the big thing of this initiative is that it is a call for action. And what I mean a call for action is before the last Food System Summit, that it was already a couple of years ago, all the ministers of agriculture from America, so including Canada and the US, signed a declaration of 16 messages that it was the things that they were needed to be done in order to have a sustainable food system in Latin America. So it's almost like a validation of the things we needed to cover. To achieve all those things, we will require, of course, that the right evidence to really show what are the most efficient interventions that are out there to achieve these goals of having a sustainable food system. So what we're trying to do is to have some evidence synthesis in which we pick some of these interventions that we know that it will help or contribute to figure out what are these best policies or best interventions. And then the second thing we're going to say is, well, once that we define which ones are the best, how much it will cost to actually implement them, and what will be the impact in Latin America of doing that. And when I mean impact, it will be the impact on production, on trade, income, poverty, and so forth. So right now we're just doing the three synthesis of evidence, in which the first one is related with innovation in the policy environment, so that what we're going to find is the policies, do first of all a mapping of the policies that are out there in Latin America, which ones have been implemented, and which ones are going to be the best ones that we found. And then the second one is related with technology, that in this case is related with the bovine sector and with emissions. So what are the best technologies that are out there that will help us in adopting these new technologies that will help producers decrease the intensity of emissions per unit of output. And then the last one is related with institutions, and is a climate action kind of thing. So it's looking at all the mechanisms and instruments that are out there that will help us contribute to the NDCs and the agenda of climate action. Thank you.
Thank you, Valeria. So now, Paolo, if you want.
Yeah, let's open the
Oh,
questions to the
list.
public. For those of you in the room, you can raise your hands. And also for those of you connected on Zoom, you can send your questions in the QA chat box and we'll read them out loud for you. Paolo?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everybody. Nice to see familiar faces as well. And
the mic closer.
Okay, so just to go to the point that you were discussing about the relationship between trade and food security, I think there is another dimension that maybe it's worth mentioning in the debate, that is also about the distributional structure of who trades and who are the food insecure, that most likely are not the same people. So I mean, as far as we say, like, more trade is better, and it is better in terms of economic efficiency and GDP and generation of foreign currency, but like not necessarily these are the people that are selling, the people that are actually affected by food insecurity. So the direct effect there might be confused by many other factors that are playing in it, and it's something that usually we don't get too much into, and it's a bit of a sensitive issue sometimes when in the policy dialogue with countries. But I do think that it's a factor that explains a lot the kind of decoupling between the two variables. Thank you.
Thanks, Paolo. Who else had their hand up? Giordano. I say Giordano because if not, it's only Paolo's in this room. So
It
Paolo
seems that
Giordano.
being called Paolo has an advantage in this meeting. No, I thank you very much for the presentation. I want to put this in a little bit of a broader perspective. And I think Valeria made a very compelling point that trade is essential for this, whether if you're a net food exporter or a net food importer is going to affect you. Now, if we look this in a longer term perspective, a more famous Piñeiro is telling us that, in fact, Latin America is exhausting like the sources of productivity of the last 20, 30 years. So, like the GAP report just showed that total factor productivity is going down and that production is growing because we're intensifying it, which is not good for the environment. It's an issue. Now, another work that we're about to publish shows that where Latin America grew in the last 20 years was on the hand of China in terms of exports. And in fact, it's only this, and competitiveness has not increased for many countries of the region. Many countries of the region actually lost competitiveness. And the work that Paolo is doing with the Agri-Monitor shows, for instance, the case of Argentina, why this is the case. No? So it seems to me that after the pandemic, we're coming to a world in which the two big sources of growth for the agricultural sector have been exhausted. The growth of productivity and trade will grow, but it will grow at slower pace than it has been in the past. So the question is, how can we, what's next? How can we think the next generation of reforms in the agricultural sector? And whether can we really think about those without thinking trade at the heart of it? Because if you look at the European Union, for instance, the deforestation regulation, or all the pressure that are on the countries to be more environmentally friendly and all that, in fact, shows that we're in a big world and the international pressure is going to be on Latin America. So it's not enough to say that we're going to be the breadbasket of the world. We have to say how and how we're going to do it and in how sustainable we're going to do it. So I don't know. I wanted to know the thought of the panel about this.
So we'll go at it now, and then we have Cesar and Olga and Cesar. Oh, you want to go now?
Thank
Okay.
you.
Well, it was Olga first. Go ahead, Cesar. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Steven, Valeria. Very nice to see you. Paolo, for me, the question is technology. Definitely. Because it's clear in the GAP report in 2023, I mean, the productivity in Latin America is going down and quite significantly.
Cesar, get the mic closer.
Sure. And this is what Valeria said clearly. One of the things that we have to do is to improve innovation, which means productivity. Of course, trade has a very important thing for food security in Latin America and the Caribbean. And in that point of view, Steven, if I understand correctly, when you say locally diets, do you mean locally produced or locally accessed in the market? It's accessed in the market, I suppose, because it's locally produced, the situation is very different. If it's locally accessed in the market, especially for food importer countries, there are a lot in Latin America, Caribbean and Central America countries. In that sense, I guess trade is critical for those countries more than the food exporter countries because of diet. So having said that, the second point is trade policies. We are coming in a pendulum in Latin America. We were free 20 years ago. We're coming to economies that are more with higher tariff or higher non-tariff restrictions. So how to convince Steven and Valeria, a Ministry of Treasury, to reduce non-tariff and tariff restrictions, especially coming after COVID, where all the economies were closed, locked down, and they wanted to have their own production, their own consumption for the poor, for the vulnerable. And that's a discussion that is still on the air, but I haven't seen something lately that is helping us, developing banks, in order to have that dialogue with the authorities. I believe trade is critical, and we need to facilitate trade, in particular in the political arena and the economic arena of Latin America and the Caribbean. Thank you.
Okay, so why don't we take those three interventions and then Olga's in the queue for the next round. Valeria, Steven.
Well, there were too many questions.
That's why.
They're all related, but very different from each other. So hopefully I remember the most important things. Paolo, I think you're totally right. And I think that that goes with the table that I had in the presentation, in which shows net food, the exporters, importers at the regional, but also globally. So yes, all those figures, what it shows is that if you're a net food exporter, you will be totally different impacted by anything if you're not a food importer. That showed with COVID, and the same thing it showed with the Ukraine crisis, how depending of in which group you were was the impact that you had in your country. So in terms of Latin America, one of the key things is net food exporters. They really depend on the foreign currency that comes from the exports. And they are really stuck with that, and they have an issue in everything. The same thing goes for the importer side, but totally opposite. No, they do not have the foreign currency to be able to import. And that's when it comes into, I don't know, FAO, World Bank, IMF, in saying, well, we should give them credit so that it helps them facilitate those things. So yes, that could be a good way of almost saying a typology of how, or clustering of countries of that. That's actually the presentations that maybe that I did through the whole Ukraine and COVID. It was how we cluster countries in a way. And depending on that clustering, it was definitely the approach you will have. So what can we do when we talked about trade? Well, it's really look at those typology or those clustering of countries and figure out what can we be done for that. But I guess that maybe your question was more for the self-sufficiency, the sovereignty of production, that is a different story, and not really. Then Paolo,
What's the answer?
I think that productivity, you've seen the soccer report that we did, that is key. If you look at the scenarios, if you reduce the yield gap, depending on which region you're talking about, that's what actually you see. Yes, developed countries have been going down in terms of that growth rate, but they started from a high point. So again, things, so in Latin America specifically, that is something. I'm from Argentina. I love Argentina, but I think that that's exactly what happened in the 90s with the technological package from the soja. Everything went great. Productivity was amazing. It grew till the 2000 and so. Argentina has been leaving, and the government has been leaving from that point because they've been super competitive. And even though all the policies, all the different type of exchange rates they have and everything, they're still being able to produce in a competitive way. However, investment, it is important. R&D is important. As Cesar was saying, innovation, we need to be thinking about that. And they haven't been investing in the sector. So that's when you're saying, and the productivity has really been going down. So what can we do moving forward? A couple of things, and I think that that connects with Cesar's question. Market access, I don't know. I don't think that it is that important at this point. It's not even discussion at the WTO or anything, because that is not the issue. Something that we as a region really needs to concentrate on is on these environmental standards, regulations, and so forth. And that is the key thing for the region, for Latin America. It goes through that. How can we harmonize the certification, like all these standards, environmental standards that we have? We have 1 million. Like if you hear what's going on with the palm oil, they have hundreds that cost money. And how you harmonize that should be something that we should really dedicate time looking at. The other thing is the labeling of the packages at the end. There are some countries, we now have the evidence to show what has worked, what hasn't worked, but we need to think about more. If you're thinking about trade, is not really what happens inside the country if I'm going to consume less sugar or not if we see the package. What we need to start thinking is how we can harmonize those labels so that at the end it doesn't cost more money to the producers. because right now it's costing a lot of money. If I want to export it to Chile, is one thing. If I want to export it to Mexico, it's another one. If I keep it home, it's a totally different story. So now they are thinking about having a QR code that it kind of just translates into what each country has it. That's a fantastic idea. But, we need to start thinking about those things if we really need to move forward, I think. But again, everything goes into the innovation, investment. And for that, we need to have money. So that's something where the bottleneck.
That was going to be my answer too. But I think to address first this the comment by Paulo number one, to say that the trade is maybe disconnected from some segments of the population is true. I don't think that's necessarily an argument against it, right? I would say maybe it's a necessary but not sufficient condition. And I think it's worth remembering as well that most small farmers are net consumers of food, right? So they're going to, to the extent that trade would reduce the cost. There are questions about the functioning of the markets and, the spatial correlation of prices and so on. But to the extent that access to trade would maybe reduce the cost of food in some cases, would benefit small farmers who are net consumers. And I think that connects to Paulo number two's point as well on the technology side, because yes, and the only thing I would add to what Valeria said about the need to invest in technology, historically, it's always been the case with technology investment that you have to sort of run to stay in one place, right? Because of what you say, because it looks like technology, because the productivity becomes exhausted. And I would just connect the 2 points by suggesting that there's an additional requirement that technology be affordable, that there be functioning extension systems. I mean, this is not a surprise, right? But it's still a challenge, even though it's not a surprise. For the final questions there, yes, they're just market prices, right? So to the extent that they're imports, these are the surveys that the International Comparisons Project does in every country for hundreds and hundreds of commodities. And the hard question here, I mean, from my perspective, because one of my fields of study is political economy. And when you say, well, how can you convince officials to, change trade policies or something like that? That's a hard question, right? Because that's intrinsically a political question. There are going to be winners and losers in every case. And, what I tell my students in my political economy seminars, you need to first identify the magnitudes of the changes, then think about who are the winners, who are the losers, and then ask questions about how are they connected to the government, who has political influence, what are the, I don't have a generic answer to that question. I mean, there's generic arguments in favor of trade reform, but it doesn't solve the political problem.
Yeah, Valeria.
Sorry, if I can add something that I think that I didn't mention it properly or say it properly in my presentation, but it goes into this. And then the other thing we need to think about is looking at exports and development and all that is we always think about the big staples, the big commodities that we export. So it's not only soy, meat, coffee, cacao. That's what we think about when we think about these big exporters. And that's why I wanted to bring up into the presentation the quinoa example, and maybe I just didn't say it properly. That is a product that is really good in terms of a healthy diet. It's very nutritious. It's local, so it helps the biodiversity, this and that. It helps smaller communities, or you also get this social component, of sustainability. We always talked about economic, environmental, and social. So we also need to start thinking about that kind of example. We have many different examples, the acai, for example, many other ones. And so it would be interesting to look with yerba mate. In Paraguay, they are doing great things with the yerba when we thought that, who was going to consume yerba? The white drinking every day, but that doesn't, it's an acquired taste. So I understand that. But they found a way of mixing it with other things and they sell it very nicely. It's full of antioxidants and all this great stuff. And so, we're really trying to find how as a region can move forward. We should be thinking about something that it is not the monocultivo, it is not this, that it hasn't have many nutritious value on that and things like that. Again, it's not the solution. And for food security, sometimes it's better to have, the amount of calories done. So I'm not saying that we should only do we need to start thinking of new things that can help in a combination of little things that we can keep doing. Thanks.
Just very briefly, I want to touch on the issue that Cesar raised about how do we discuss this with the authorities? Because that's a key issue for us, absolutely essential. And that's where, high quality knowledge first, and second, high quality dialogue are absolutely two essential components of that equation. And that's where we are trying to, have our role. We do not aspire to dominate or to answer all of the problems, absolutely not. But if we can address some of the specific issues that they have, that we would have made some progress. Let me tell you that in the upcoming dialogue, regional policy dialogue, we are inviting agricultural authorities and trade authorities. Pedro and R&D guys are coming with us, and we're going to address some of these issues. But another important ingredient of that, dialogue quality has to do with the fact that we are separating. In one dialogue, we're having the Latin Americans, and in another dialogue later on, 2 months later, we're having the Caribbeans. Because segmenting the dialogue is important because of the, some of the reasons, some of the factors and questions that we are raising here. We have to specify, we have to be more granular, we have to be more country specific and sub-region specific in order to be effective in terms of the, the policy prescriptions, the suggestions, the quality of the interventions that we want to propose, etc. But we will go from there based on high quality knowledge and with very good dialogue. Thank you.
Gracias, Jaime. So thanks, guys. So one more round of questions because we're running over time a little bit. So Olga, and I thought that I had seen a hand back there.
We have some questions
Oh,
from
okay.
people.
From anybody else from the floor? No. Okay, so Olga, go.
Thank you very much. I found this topic fascinating. I'm a tourism specialist, so I would like to talk a little bit about a different form of trade, which is basically international tourism, which is trade services. But I think it can have a very big impact if we consider that in some destinations we have 10 international visitors per one resident, or even higher. Or if we consider that 9 out of the 26 borrowing member countries of IDB have 15% of their exports that are travel and tourism, or that importance as well in terms of income from people in rural areas, etc. And as well, the tourists, when they go to the territories, to the destination, they need, by definition, to consume food. So I've tried to find some research in the impact of tourism, international tourism in particular, particularly with all the COVID and how it affected so many countries. And I would like to know, because I didn't find much of any a lot of literature on this topic, if you can share some thoughts on it, if you think it's something that has been well researched or not, or if you consider it could be interesting, because I see from the different dimensions of food security how tourism can impact in many of them in many ways. And thank you very much for the presentation. It was super interesting. Thank you.
Thanks, Olga. So from the chat.
Hi. I have some questions from our virtual audience. This is specifically for Mr. Granados. To
For
what
Mr.
extent
Granados.
the trade-related competitiveness of Latin America to export agri-food considers the non-internalized environmental costs? What about the unsustainability of virtual water trade in food commodities grown in water vulnerable regions?
So I think the last question. I didn't completely follow the question, if I'm being honest. I mean, we know that tourism suffered greatly from COVID, but what am I missing?
To rephrase it. So
Got it?
tourism expenditures, that international tourism expenditures are an export. So it's an export, and it means that people who come from another country, so it's an export, but it's never considered under any of these scenarios, paper, etc. But it's an export by definition. So, and it can impact in the way that population can have access, they can afford those baskets, or it can impact, on the contrary, rising prices.
No, Olga, I think we got it. So we at IFPRI, it's international food and policy, so we don't really look at tourism. So I wouldn't know in the details. However, we did a lot of work with COVID And what we found, so that we did have that classification or disaggregation to include tourism. And the key answer of your question is like, the way COVID affected was that, of course, there was no tourism at all. So that affects, the first direct impact is in foreign currency, so that all those countries were really affected because nothing was coming in. So that really limits the way that they could buy then their own food, that in general, they depends on that for import. So that was the connection there. So that's all. Thanks.
Yeah, very briefly about the question. I agree. It's a good question. There are some sectors in some products in which some part of the production is probably undertakes non-sustainable practices. That's something that takes place in Latin America and worldwide. It's not a specific regional problem. So the question is how to address those major challenges. And there, the answer is that, well, little by little and carefully and in the least disruptive manner, but effectively at the same time. You cannot, and that these are big discussions that we are having now, given the sudden implementation of very strict environmental standards, something that we have to do, but carefully, taking into account the specific conditions of SMEs, of, very humble people in the field, etc. They need to change. There has been important changes over time, but this cannot be made overnight. So that's part of our role in trying to suggest answers that are sustainable financially, operationally, administratively, etc., that are acceptable, but that are effective at the same time. Because if we are not effective, then we're wasting our time. So yes, the answer is there, and the question is there, and the answer needs we need time and effectiveness in that regard.
Okay, so we're gonna come to a close, and again, I want to thank Valeria, Stephen, and Jaime for coming to our Knowledge Week. It's been great to see and hear your presentations. There's several things. I was biting my tongue not to talk, because if I get involved, then it becomes somebody else's show. But I just wanted to say, so important message, I think, is food security and trade, they're interrelated. There must not be a message understood that they're not interrelated. But they are not the solution to all of the problems of food insecurity. And that's very important. One of the things we're trying to tackle in our research with AgriMonitor and policy analysis is trying to link trade policies and ag policies to food security. Because that's a question in and of itself. It's because ag trade is a big question. Ag trade and its effect on food security, it's a different question. You have to look at it with look at the dimensions and the indicators related to food security and try to understand what that relationship is. And I think it's very important, because you look into the next few years, we're going to be talking about this. We had stopped talking about it. We're talking about it again. And it's very, very important. This disaggregation that you guys at Tufts are doing on what's the cost of a healthy diet, adequacy, calorie or nutrient, I think it's great work. And what I like to explore into the future is you have 177 countries. Try to go into those, the Latin American ones, trying to understand that a little bit better. And because I think I may be mistaken, but you show the numbers are consistent with what FAO found. Latin America has the highest cost of a healthy diet. They're consistent with those numbers. But then in the last column, you said, it's not bad in terms of affordability as a whole, because it's only 9% of the cost of a healthy diet for the income, 9% of the income. But then again, it's at a high cost. So one may be, misled by all these numbers, and I think there's a mining of numbers there that need to be explored and need to be worked on in order to make better policies for healthy diet. Because I think that's the next round for Latin America in terms of, we not only have the highest cost, but we have, in terms of the aggregate, But we also have very worrisome numbers in terms of indicators associated to healthy diet in terms of obesity, non-transmittable diseases that are related to diet. So that there's an issue there that needs to be looked at in terms of policy. And I think it's great. We look forward to working with you guys, I think. And then thanks again, Jaime, for bringing in that, reality check. You have to have the dialogue, which is in tune with what Steven said. You have to have the political economy behind it. You have to know who you're talking to. You have to know how to talk to those people you're talking to about what is possible to talk about in the different the negotiations. And I think that's great that you're doing that in terms of, separating and trying to focus groups by groups that are more homogeneous in their own discourse that helps you have that policy dialogue. So I learned a lot in this hour and a half. It's great. And as my friend Cesar Falconi says, technology is the solution to most things. I agree with that. Thanks a lot. Again, to everybody. Thanks.
Thank you all. Thank you all for joining us today, speakers and attendees. We invite you to visit the IDB's YouTube channel to rewatch this event and also our previous ones, part of the series Seeds for Food Security. And don't forget to check out our social media for extra content on agriculture, food security, climate change, and much more. Thank you and good evening.
No puede ser reunión previa a OPC. No. Si tienes reuniones con OPC, supongo. Le solicitamos amablemente que incluyan al equipo operativo de las gerencias las reuniones previas a lo que se refiere a los proyectos que están en preparación, ¿cierto? Le solicitamos amablemente que incluyan